Kate Mila-Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book, and this week I have a book that we've actually made reference to in the past because we've had the author of the book on our channel. I'm talking about the illustrious Stephan Schwartz, and he's coming back for a chat with me about this book specifically. He wrote the book, it's on the floor, I can't reach it. The Alexandria Project, if you remember, remote viewing for archaeological sites that had been lost to time in Egypt, in the desert, and in the harbor of the ancient city of Alexandria. And he has led a very interesting life. What a remarkable person. And he knows everybody. It's astounding. This book is, I think, I don't know how he would feel about this, and I have not read all of his books. Now I've got them in a pile by my feet, and I will show them to you probably the next video. So this is video number one on the 8 laws of change, how to be an agent of personal and social transformation. I believe this is an extremely important book because it gives us a path to follow, and it's clear and it's really interesting. And I spent the whole time, you would think, little tiny book, right? You would think, no, this will be fast. This is what I thought. This is going to be an easy read, quick, take a few notes, we're done. So dense with information. And I've had to sort of condense or jump over some examples, personal narratives. I really tried to simplify his references to a lot of scientific and sociological, psychological studies. So I would say that this is going to be an overview of this book, but if you really want to dig deep, deep, deep into it, I would recommend reading it, How to Be an Agent of Personal and Social Transformation. And I would recommend that you keep in mind, because I know where the majority of people who are subscribed to this channel, I kind of have a feel for where you guys are coming from. And it's kind of the diametric opposite of where Stephan Schwartz is coming from. And yet we meet in the middle. It fascinates me. I told him that our understanding of the reasons behind some of this stuff is really different. And yet we agree about everything. I think that means we're probably all on to something. Semantics, right? So let's start this book. I'm going to do my best to do it justice. I feel like this is a really important book. So the introduction is called The First Priority. By the way, it was written in 2015, right before our current hellscape. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And he talks about his life in the introduction, that 4 times in his life he encountered moments of really significant change, that he was able to play an instrumental part in those changes. The first was the civil rights movement, and he described standing at the Lincoln Memorial and listening as Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Happened to be there because he was marching for civil rights. The second one is he was instrumental in changing the American military from what it had been, which was elitist and a conscript organization where you got drafted and you had no choice, to an all-volunteer meritocracy. And he said it actually led to significant changes. For example, however you might feel, somebody like Colin Powell, a man of color, not born in the United States, and not a West Point graduate, who rose to the highest level, the highest ranks. That would not have been possible in the old military. Then he was part of a citizen diplomacy movement, kind of sub rosa. Not everybody knew about it. They did a backdoor approach to try to thaw the Cold War between Russia, USSR, and the United States with ordinary people. And today he feels he's contributing significantly and he is, to the consciousness movement. And he says this goes hand in hand with the environmental movement, so he doesn't necessarily want to ignore that either. There's a loose association, he says, and it coalesces, and he can see all the interconnectedness between those issues. And he says it's because they share a life-affirming worldview. And one of the other things they have in common, and they're rarely discussed in mainstream media. They'll talk about storms and floods and the loss of property. They're inclusive, he says, these issues, because many of the messages deal with issues in a compassionate and nonviolent way. Today, he says, we're in a semi-managed crisis of transition. That most of our problems result from a focus on profit. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. And often it's the principal or only social priority in decision making. He believes that we need to flip the script and that it should be well-being as the primary priority, the consideration. So how the challenge is you got to appeal, to that urge. So how do you make a profit? By creating wellness. He says the earth demands that we change. And he says it's not a question of if we change, it's how much pain are we going to suffer before we finally do change. He saw that successful, nonviolent, life-affirming social transformations share certain learnable characteristics. So, he's got a very, very organized mind. I really appreciate that. He says this book will focus on these things. The first is a focus on change that begins with the individual and reaches a critical consensus. The second focus is to present stories to illustrate the techniques that he suggests for life-affirming, compassionate, social transition. And the third focus is to highlight social and neuroscience research of why this process works. And this is, to me, perhaps one of the most astounding parts. I don't think it's astounding that one act of common decency can cause a ripple. We know that, but they're learning so much about the brain and human interaction and the psychology of social interaction driven by neuroscience. It's fascinating. So in history, he says there have been 3 ways of social transformation. Advances in science and technology, and we're all in the middle of that. Change that's compelled by physical power, and you can see that going on in several places internationally. This kind of change is coercive, violent, and zero-sum. And the third kind of change, it's like this is going to be our preference, small individual choices. They're subtle, they're compassionate, they're life-affirming. And these laws of change make reference to that. He says studies show that despite all the monuments that say otherwise, violent change is deadly, short-lived, and a repeating pattern. So for example, Erica Chenoweth is one of the top 100 global thinkers. And a lot of times now, moving forward in the book, I have skipped things like the names of these big research organizations or institutes or schools. They're in the book and they're easy to locate. I want to talk about what they did and not take your time up with information that, it's going to go in one ear and out the other. The institute of that, the university of this, the committee, the commission, the conference, it just becomes gobbledygook when that's not the real crux of the message. So Erica Chenoweth was chosen as one of the top 100 global thinkers for the empirical study of civil resistance. She worked with Maria Stephan, I don't know, they focused on the dynamics of civil resistance to see how violent conflict it can be prevented and how democracy can develop. They teamed up to survey the social outcomes from violence versus nonviolent transformations. You'd think somebody would have looked at this, right? So they looked at more than 100 large social transformations between 1900 and 2006. And their results were too lengthy for me to write down. Their results were, the most striking find, nonviolent resistant campaigns were nearly twice as likely to achieve full or partial success as their violent counterparts. So only 25% of the nonviolent campaigns were total failures, while only 25% of the violent campaigns succeeded. So only a quarter of nonviolence doesn't have a successful outcome, while only a quarter of the violent ever does. So they're completely diametrically opposite in result. And their conclusions were true across many, many, many variables. Quote, our central contention is that nonviolent campaigns have a participation advantage over violent insurgencies, which is an important factor in determining campaign outcomes. If you want to be there, you're more likely to struggle harder. The moral, physical, informational, and commitment barriers to participation are much lower for nonviolent resistance than for violent insurgency. This would seem obvious, but I guess, you know, somebody had to actually study it and quantify it to get the point across. Also, and I think this is really important, the nonviolent approach is almost always longer lasting. And it depends on individual choices. So it starts at the core of society, the person. And it has to reach enough people in number for the change to happen. Even a massive revolutionary change can happen with the commitment of a core of committed adults. It depends on individuals making compassionate, life-affirming choices. Now, you can get violent change from a small group of people, but it's not going to last. So chapter 2, quotidian choices. Quotidian is such a great word because it comes from the Latin, and it basically means every day. Little things you do every day. We used to freak ourselves out. This is not in the book. We used to freak ourselves out as children. We'd sit around and say, just imagine, if I pick up that cup right now, my whole life will be entirely different. Children grasp more than you would think. So chapter 2, quotidian choices. So the secret to this long-term nonviolent change is the quotidian choice, the individual choice. Small moments of compassionate and life-affirming choice. And I'm going to interject here that he says it so much better than I ever have. But I've tried to say this for a long time. When it becomes too much, focus in on your daily life, your neighborhood, your family, the people around you. What small thing can you do today that's helpful, compassionate, ethical? He says it so much better, though. So these choices are presented multiple times a day. What car you drive, where you drive, or should you walk. The pesticides you use on your lawn, the kind of lawnmower you use, the kind of detergent you wash your clothes with. And there are a lot of variables why we make these choices. And I would say, because this is my experience, that very frequently the most ethical choice is actually financially prohibitive. And that sounds like an excuse, but you have to live the life of the person saying that to understand that it's not always just an empty excuse. And that's not on the individual. That's our society that makes it so. So that, you know, you're supposed to eat organic fruits and vegetables. A lot of families can't afford that, or they're inaccessible. So these are the things we have to start thinking about, making changes. Another example would be the speed of the change from slurs and maybe less flattering vocabulary to the use of LGBTQ, which implies a level of respect, an awareness of a level of respect. It's a shift in consciousness. And the worst thing, he says, is climate change. That's a huge issue. The UN had an intergovernmental panel on climate change, and it does it frequently. So he said in 1990, and he goes on to explain how nothing came of it, and it got very little response, and I just wrote yawn, because that's what it was, a big yawn. In 1995, it happened again. 2001, not a lot of response. But the conclusions it drew when it put out its report in 2007 shook the world. In 2014, which was the most recent when he had written the book, I went online and looked it up. There was one, the 6th assessment in 2022. And so jumping over what they concluded in 2014, which is now out of date, in 2022, not from the book, from my research, just the conclusion of this UN panel was that this is a real problem and we're creating it. In 2014, they said this, and this was pretty plain. This is a quote. A rapid shift to less polluting energy will be needed to avoid catastrophic global warming because global emissions of heat-trapping greenhouse gases have accelerated to unprecedented lengths. And the source that it summarizes is carbon emissions from coal, oil, and gas. Now, this is the UN talking. And they recommend we move off of carbon-based energy, within a century, or, and I'm not sure if I summarized this. No, I summarized this, but he almost said this, bye-bye, civilization. In 2012, NASA and the California Institute of Technology said that by 2100, 49% of the Earth's land surface will be undergoing plant community changes, and 37% of the world's terrestrial ecosystems will be undergoing biome scale changes. This means that whole forests, deserts, lakes, the features that define our world will be changing. So then you're looking at not only climate, but you're looking at food and livability, and it just spirals. And this is not meant to have us all leave in a deep, dark depression, because this book is full of very helpful ways of coping with this. But we have to set the stage. So we have precious little time left to change. Quote from the Potsdam International Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Quote, there is a clear message from science. To avoid dangerous interference with the climate system, we need to move away from business as usual. So the mainstream media, and especially Fox, present all this as a huge controversial thing that people are debating. There's absolutely no debate. This is scientific truth. Science is overwhelmingly agreeing with this. Of 10,885 papers in 2013, only 2 disagreed. And you can go on Stephan Schwartz's website, and he has an incredible resource of documentation, papers, everything that he talks about, he documents. And I suspect he reads everything. He says this is not a controversy in the field of science or climate or NASA or international opinion. Absolutely indisputable. We are destroying the equilibrium of the biosphere, period. And we don't seem to understand that we are a part of the global metasystem, and in fact, those terms would probably not mean much to most people. So he cites many ancient texts on Gaia trying to read my handwriting. Gaia as a living organism, and these are ancient, but today science actually agrees. All notable modern physicists believed that there was a fundamental role of the consciousness. And he does go into describing this throughout the book, and it is actually fascinating. They don't teach you this. I mean, I studied biology in college. Was my pseudo major. That was my major. I don't know how much of a scientist I ever was, but I remember learning about all these people, and I never learned the things that Stephan Schwartz talks about. Quotations from them. So Max Planck, 1931. He said, matter derives from consciousness. All life is interconnected. He's a physicist, right? The biosphere goes above us, far above our planet, and deep into our planet. It's all connected. And we don't even know how high up and how far below. James Lovelock recommends that climate-controlled cities be built, and he has given up on large expanses of land to for anything, to try to help, because he thinks that will rapidly become uninhabitable. He says that actually our goal shouldn't be to save the world, it should be a rapid retreat to save ourselves. It's kind of dark. So his question is, what can I do? And the answer simply, and it sounds very simple, but it's quotidian choices. And he's going to give examples of how a small choice by one person really significantly changed the world for very many people. Small, mundane, individual choices become expressed collectively. Little choices are the key. And he said, for example, marriage equality. For example, the legalization of marijuana. These are things that began with a small, I was going to say grassroots, a small number of people, and they became a large movement. Research shows that these 8 laws actually work. So let me see here. I don't want to skip anything. Chapter 3 is called Beingness. So he had a good friend who was a writer, a kind of a tough guy. He didn't like, for example, Mother Teresa's theology and her involvement with rich, famous, you know, people, always getting her picture taken and stuff. He thought that she was a fraud. And he interviewed her and was shocked to discover that this woman had an overwhelming aura about her. Nothing you could see, but you could feel it. And he went in a skeptic. And he said that this aura was so overwhelming that he immediately, after talking to her, felt the urge to quit, move to India, and work with her. Gandhi said that what they'd done and said did not get England to leave India, the political stuff that they did. He said it was the nature of our character that got them to choose and then leave. This is positive life affirming beingness. It's the energy around you, I guess. I mean, Stephan doesn't believe in energy. That's one of the things we have. But what you emanate. And he said it's at the core of social transformation, and it's inherently based on nonviolence. And he says it's created around you by the many choices you make on a daily basis. It's a social quality. It's a sense of responsibility to the larger world. It's an acknowledgement of all these choices as a political and then social consensus. Each individual perceives every other differently, depending on the numinosity of the observed. Numinosity means the presence of the divine. Comes from a Roman word that actually goes back to the gods, household type gods, but modern usage has to do with the Latin for nod or divine will, but it goes back farther than that because I remember studying it. But you think of numinosity as holiness. Kind of your invisible aura that you let off, your halo, you know. And it can be a person or a state of liberation, or oh no, I'm sorry, I'm misreading my handwriting, and this really is pretty funny. I'm glad I caught it. It could be a person that's emanating this, or it can be an object like the Statue of Liberty. It symbolizes something larger than itself. It gives the significance out from its context to a culture or a group. I mean, I remember seeing the Statue of Liberty. I'm pretty hard-boiled. I was impressed. And you read many, many personal stories of people coming across to Ellis Island, and their first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty as they came into the harbor brought them to tears. So let's see here. Carl Jung says, use this in a sentence, and Stephan likes this quote. We should not be in the least surprised if the empirical manifestations of unconsciousness contents bear all the marks of something illimitable, something not determined by space-time. This quality is numinous. Noumena are psychic entia. Okay. So numinosity is holiness, and it increases with, your holiness increases with each of your individual acts. So this is sounding suspiciously religious, theological, spiritual, new agey. I don't know. I just think it's interesting how similarly these ideas run in parallel. They don't always completely agree. They don't always use the same vocabulary, but the kernel at the center is what matters. And these individual acts, especially when they're done in a heightened emotional state, either a very positive or negative state, that's important. People ask all the time, how do these really horrible people become so successful? You know, our typical image, you know, Hitler, Mussolini, people like that. How do they become so successful if they're so horrible? Well, it's the intensity of their individual choices day by day. If we looked at it from a New Age point of view, we would say, you know, they're focused intention and they act on it. So there is a shadow side. Gandhi, the Nazis. Albert Speer, who was the architect and an arms minister for them, said of Hitler that said this about Hitler, the intensity of the aura that he put out. And that's from somebody who worked with him a lot and knew him well. So, interestingly, Albert Speer was the only Nazi at Nuremberg who pled guilty and spent years. He got out of Spandau in 1966, the prison. He was imprisoned all that time. So, roughly 20 years. But he was the only one who pled guilty. Then we have this. This is from an interview by a guy who was in Hitler's circle, and well, this is also from Albert Speer, sorry. He says, I asked myself time and again how much of it was a kind of auto-suggestion, this going along with the Nazi thing. One thing is certain, everyone who worked closely with Hitler for a long time was exceptionally dependent on him. However, they were in their own domain, close to him, they became small and timid. So no matter how big shot they were around Hitler, they shrank. Nazi military leader Hermann Göring made Speer's point. He's reported to have told Finance Minister Schacht, quote, I try so hard, but every time I stand beside the Führer, my heart drops into the seat of my pants. Okay. So beingness begins with one's choices, and it resonates and causes social change. Gandhi made life-affirming changes, and Hitler operated from a dark pool of anger and humiliation. And those are extreme examples of either way, individual beingness. And it shows how intensely held individual beingness can resonate and spread. So it becomes a collective gestalt. And this intention, this focused series of choices. It's why the bad guys often succeed. They manifest it. This boils down to individual choice, intention, and then the decisions expressing it, which is what the Hermetic philosophers also said. You have to have the thought creates, you have the intention, and you act on that, but you have to do the action. Examples of nonviolent movements, got a bunch of them here, that were started by ordinary people and carried on by ordinary people with zero power. Abolition, public education, penal reform, women's suffrage, civil rights, the nuclear freeze, and environmental protection. So they all were transformational of the self with a common intention shared with others, the beingness, based on common values. And often he acknowledges that they're religiously or spiritually driven, at least initially. But just because something is a religion doesn't mean it's going to be life-affirming. And remember, this book was written in 2015, and we are well aware now of the pivotal influence of white Christian nationalism, the negative influence. This strategy of beingness is not instant, like an invasion would be instant. You're not going to get that immediate satisfaction of change. Violence has an immediacy, but it has no care, and it doesn't care about things like collateral damage. I think we're aware of what's going on across the water, right? So beingness is slower because it's happening on a deeper level. It changes people's hearts, and therefore it is more enduring. Small daily choices can bring about changes in worldview or changes in culture with a minimum of violence and hurt. And what he's going to talk about, but I'm going to throw it out here now and we'll repeat it as often as we can. You can't go into it expecting any particular outcome. You just have to put your head down and make those small choices constantly and work with others towards that and others towards that, and trust that that will bring about change. And research shows it does. Most historical social change, he notes, was progressive transformation. And interestingly, they had Quakers at the core. And he comments on this quite a bit. They show up again and again to an astonishing degree. The proportion is out of whack statistically. They had an enormous influence in many social change movements. In all of American history between the colonial era and now, there have been total of fewer than 1 million Quakers in the United States. But today there are 87,000, which astounds me. I had no idea there were so few. 359,000 worldwide. That's fascinating. My husband ostensibly was raised a Quaker. But when you dig, I was asking him about this today, the other day, and it cracks me up. His mother was a big fan of Richard Nixon. And they took the family to the Quaker church, not because, well, meeting house, not because they were committed to any ideology. They were very conservative. But because there was the possibility of running into Nixon. I suppose that's as well thought out as most human beings commit to their religious beliefs. It just cracked me up because I was thinking, oh, you know, here I am, I'm married to him for a very long time. We never really talked about what it was like to grow up a Quaker. It was just like anything else. You sat there for an hour and just waited for somebody to say something, and he didn't really have any concept of what their belief system was. And it was the opposite of how his family felt about a lot of important social topics. So that's weird. So anyway, his list of major socially progressive, life-affirming change they all began with a few Quakers who joined in common intention. I think that's utterly fascinating. So how did such a tiny number of people bring about change in huge social norms or laws? Well, he said that the adherence to these 8 laws that he has, it's not the unique domain of Quakers, but their efforts can be clearly seen. Now, I'm going to read this list just once so that we can go over it. And I will make reference to it as he does throughout the book. He'll say, this is an example of law 2. And I may or may not actually refer back to the wording of the law, but you're all going to get the book. So, okay. So the first law, individuals individually and the group collectively must share a common intention. Law number 2. The individuals and the group may have goals, but they may not have cherished outcomes. Law number 3, the individuals in the group must accept that their goals may not be reached in their lifetime, and they have to be okay with this. I often think of the suffragettes, the first wave of suffragettes. 4th law, the individuals in the group must accept that they may not get either credit or acknowledgement for what they have done, and be authentically okay with this. The 5th law, each person in the group, regardless of gender, religion, race, or culture, must enjoy fundamental equality even as the various roles in the hierarchy of the effort are respected. 6th law, the individuals in the group must forswear violence in word, act, or thought. 7th law, the individuals in the group and the group itself must make their private selves consistent with their public postures. I'm tempted to bring up a name that didn't, but I won't. 8th law, the individuals in the group and the group collectively must always act from the beingness of life-affirming integrity. So those are the laws, specifically. Now we're on chapter 4. How many people does it take? So it's true that the Bible is held as a central document of Western culture. So the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a story that's known quite widely. And why is that? So he argues it because it clearly illustrates for the people of the time the power of choice and the beingness from choices consistent with compassion and life-affirming attitudes. It shows that a fraction of a group is enough to change the destiny of all just because of the choices of that fraction. And his example is the argument that Lot has with, Abraham. Oh, it's Abraham and the Lord, and they're having this argument. And the Lord says, Lot's trying to negotiate, what if we find 10 honest people? What if we find 2? What if we find 1? And the Lord says, Abraham says, suppose only 10 decent people are found. And the Lord replied, then I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the point here is one decent person can evoke huge positive change. The beingness of 10 against the sin of 2,000 is how he compares this. Then Lot is in a small village and he has the ability to save 200 people. So yes, one person can have some significant change. Then he talks about the Nobel Peace Prize. I thought this was really, 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 really interesting. It's been given to 128 people. Now this is by 2014, right before the book was published in 2015. So by that time, it had been given to 128 people, some of them government officials, leaders, and ordinary people. But the largest number of ordinary people have been women, 14.9%. And mostly it's from societies where women have no power. So the first example, 1976, Mairead Corrigan and Betty Williams, they were in their 30s. They founded a community of peace people in Belfast. my hometown. My Raid was a clerical worker, and Betty was a housewife and a mother, but they organized 4 months of rallies for peace, and these were peaceful rallies, which is huge because, and eventually hundreds of thousands of people were involved, and it really was the beginning of a peace movement there. And they won the Nobel Peace Prize. 1992, and I'm going to say this wrong, I'm sorry. Rigoberta Menchú, an impoverished Mayan coffee picker, was a leading advocate for indigenous women's rights and cultural reconciliation in Guatemala and then in the Western Hemisphere. In 2004, Wangari Muta Maathai in Kenya was the first woman in all of, this is mind-blowing, 2004, the first woman of all Eastern and Central Africa to get her PhD. She works at the Department of Veterinary Anatomy at the University of Nairobi. 1976, she got women to plant trees to offset deforestation, and by 2004, they had planted 20 million trees. Then there's this famous story everybody knows, 2014, Malala Yousafzai, 17 years old, who fought for the right to education and was shot for it and survived and continued to fight. She shared it with an Indian Hindu Gandhian, Kailash Satyarthi, and somebody else who also fought for the education of children. Now we're on chapter 5, Bead for Life, and this is a mind-boggling story. Most people don't do anything to make big changes because they feel they have no power, no money, no influence, and no larger support. Wait till you hear this. So, what can just an ordinary person do? You can make compassionate, life-affirming choices, and here's an example. In 2003, a guy called Charles Steinberg, who was an AIDS expert, and his wife, Torkin Wakefield, they went to Uganda to teach about AIDS for 3 months. It was his job to go, and she decided to go with him. And she had no idea what she was going to do. She was really worried. You know, what the heck am I going to do in Uganda? Excuse me. For 3 months. So her friends, her female friends, had a going away gathering for her. And out of the blue, this wasn't part of a larger, you know, philosophical or religious thing. They decided, let's do this little ceremony. So they sat around, excuse me, they lit a candle, and they quietly set the intention that for her, she would make compassionate, life-affirming decisions when she got there, and that they would concentrate on that. So off they went to Uganda, and she was at loose ends, and she realized there was an AIDS orphanage associated with her husband's job. So she started volunteering at the AIDS orphanage, and 2 of her friends from this ceremony back home showed up to visit, and they were all completely overwhelmed by the poverty, the extreme poverty. It was a life-changing experience for them. So they went walking together through some kind of marketplace thing. And this is in the heart of the really poor section. And they met a woman named Millie Grace Akina. She was a widow and a refugee from the warlord Coney up in the north. Her husband had died in this conflict. And she'd fled with her 6 children, one of whom was disabled because he was stealing children, assaulting the girls, keeping them, and then putting these very young boys with guns to fight. And this poor woman had no source of income. 6 children, no income. But she was sitting on the side of the road making little beads out of paper. And, oh, I guess her husband had died of AIDS, and so this was this community, but they were escaping Coney, so a lot going on. She said there were many, many, many women with small children who didn't have a job. The only thing they could get was breaking rocks into gravel by hand. She said she preferred to make handmade beads into beautiful necklaces. And she had all these gorgeous necklaces, and you can go on, just Google it. They're Etsy and Amazon. They're all over the place, and they're absolutely beautiful. But she had no way to sell them. She said she did it because it made her feel good, and she got all the paper and stuff from the dump. It was all free to make it. So in the next few years, few days, every time someone saw Torkin, she bought one and was wearing it. Every time she encountered anybody who saw it, they just loved it, and she would give it to them, go back and buy another one and wear that and give it away again. And she realized there is a market for these. I don't think that Millie, the maker, understands there's a market for these. They're beautiful. So she returned to Millie and she said, let's get women together who can do this. So the next day, they gathered together 45 women who showed up. So this is your group with an individual at the core the group shares a common intention. And this is the second law. They didn't know what they were going to do. They had goals to make life better, try to sell these things, but they didn't have a cherished outcome. So there's nothing to get depressed and disappointed about. You're just focusing on the work at hand. So her friends took samples of these beads. They were Torkin was from Boulder, Colorado. So her friends went back home, took samples, and sold them at the farmer's market on a weekend. And were shocked to see the reaction. And meanwhile, Charles and Torkin extended their stay for a year. There was such a high need for them. So she had to return to Boulder to deal with their house. They hadn't planned on being gone that long. So she had to go do whatever she had to do back home. And she took a bunch of these beads, these necklaces. So there was just this huge interest at the farmer's market. They sold $1,000 worth in just a couple of hours. So they got together again in her living room and they lit a candle and they set the intention that they were going to try to figure out how to expand the sale of these things to help these poor women. They didn't know what that would be. And it worked because, for one thing, the beauty of the beads, they really are beautiful. The story of the women, you know, it tugs at your heart. And then it's an opportunity for women in America to help to eradicate poverty somewhere. You know, we don't always know what to do. It haunts us at night and we don't know what to do about it. So they decided to use an approach of the intimacy of the story and the intimacy of women's relationships and the generosity of women, because we know that's true. And they started to do what a lot of women have done in the past to create a career for themselves. Home parties, you know, like Tupperware and Avon and that kind of thing. So it was just women helping women. That's law number 5. And I will remind you, each person in the group, regardless of gender, religion, race, or culture, must enjoy fundamental equality, even as the various roles in the hierarchy of the effort are respected. They were not looking down on these women. They were not considering them the CEOs and you're the factory workers. They were on equal footing. So they slowly worked on improving the quality of the beads. And at this point, they had 90 AIDS widows making necklaces. And one woman made $8 one day. And she took the $8 home and showed her sons, and they all sat and cried, because this was a phenomenal wealth to them. So it shows you the level of poverty. It's not a charity. All these women worked. If you didn't work, then you didn't get to participate. They transformed their lives from poverty to the middle class of where they lived. They had regular work. They had stability. And when you don't have employment and you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you don't know what your vulnerability will subject you to, it creates a state of instability that is just really vicious. So there was a small article. Some woman presented an article to Oprah magazine, and 2004, it got attention Then another friend built a website, and they ended up using the website to create sales, and they made $90,000 in sales. So they rented an office in Boulder. They hired an office manager, and this way they had the capability of organizing way more volunteers back in Africa and way more parties in the United States. They were also able to pay for shipping, and they began a training program in Uganda for the women, not only how to make the necklaces, but how to start their own businesses, how to handle money. They'd never had money. They'd never had bank accounts. So they gave them business loans, and these women became independent, and they were required to pay the loans back. There were lots of requests to give parties, and so one of the things that she did is she got the women in Uganda together to sing traditional songs, and they recorded a CD of traditional music for the parties. And if you had a party, you got a box, and in the box they had the CD, they had examples of the beads, they had life stories of the women. They created a DVD they put online to show people not only the necklaces, but also how the money was being spent and the compassion that that could evoke for the women involved. They branched out into necklaces and bracelets and earrings, and then they included for the parties recipes from Uganda for the parties. So they linked women in North America and Africa with a common intention. And and they included bios and pictures of the Ugandan women and children. Then the big step was to create bank accounts for them. The organization helped secure money from, they helped secure their money from what I called vultures, and this was people who would take advantage of them. I mean, the poverty is extreme, and if somebody knew that they had money, for example, a boyfriend or a husband who was a problem, they would take all their money. Women had no power. So they helped them establish bank accounts that nobody else had access to, that they themselves, the women in Uganda themselves, could not just be coerced into going in and taking the money out. There were terms involved and protections set up for these women. So the organization started, they were keeping some of the money that was made. They turned the profits back into the community for these women. They lived in slums, and they went in and replaced cardboard walls and cardboard roofs, and helped to build outhouses because those didn't exist at all, and more outhouses because the few they did have were used by dozens and dozens of people. They improved clean water supply, and in 3 years they had put $41 million into this slum housing and improved the lives of more than 3,000 women, all from selling handmade beads that started out being made from paper from a dump. And they got access to scrap paper now from sources for free. And their children, because they had a job, because they could afford uniforms and shoes and books and food, the children started being educated. They could go to school. Then they got a connection with Habitat for Humanity. I'm getting chills. I just love this story. They got a connection with Habitat for Humanity. They bought 18 acres of land outside the slum area in Uganda. They built affordable and appropriate to the culture housing, and the women all moved together into this area. They formed their own town council. They had a functional community of over 1,000 people, and still 3,000 involved in the original village. When the Kony soldiers left the north and the Uganda refugees returned, they discovered a war-torn land. So BeadForLife showed up in the north and got 760 women together. Traditionally, women's activity in that area was collecting shea nuts and running a market in shea nuts, just local farmers market. It was called women's gold, even by the traditional people. It was the traditional women's work. So they helped them design a line of soaps and creams and balms with the shea butter. And by 2012, They had helped more than 12,000 poor women. They then began an ox plow program for the farmers in the area. They started educational programs for girls and women. They started health programs, which is so important. And these are laws too. The individual and the group may have goals, but they may not have cherished outcomes. They just did it because they felt it was right. And law number 4, which is the individuals must accept that they may not get credit or acknowledgement and be okay with that. So they were helping more than 1,000 women work. And these women were making an average of $300 a month. But this was in a country with an annual income, I hope you're sitting down, annual income of $490. And that's not a typo. So they were making in a month almost as much as most people on average in their country were making in a year. This elevated their lives. Some of them hired employees. By 2013, they had a $3.5 million a year operation going on with the shea butter thing. They transformed thousands of lives. They began with 3 women with no power and no money and just a life-affirming and compassionate intention. Just blows my mind. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Because it's the end of the chapter. It's a good place to stop. And I hope that this has just given you chills right up and down your spine, because I think it's absolutely remarkable. And I'll be back in a minute with video number 2, Song of Foil.